Great. Well, welcome back. It's been a fantastic day with so many of you joining us from all across the planet to talk about real global issues in real specific ways, and hopefully tied to a sense as to how to explore the world around you a little bit better, how to take action about things that you're seeing, and understand our impact on the land around us in Sustain the Land, conference number 4. That's been our focus. And I wanted to thank the partners that have made the Shout Project possible. The Smithsonian, whose experts you've been hearing from throughout the day today. And we're going to go outside of off the mall, if you will, and head down to Panama in a few moments to hear from one special Smithsonian expert, to Microsoft Partners in Learning. And you've been seeing links off to the Partners in Learning website, and among many other resources, a great place to go and keep the dialogue going with other teachers. And if you're a student here today, you might have headed over to the Taking It Global TIG Ed classroom, and I'll put links up to all of these places. But the partners have been really excited about meeting all of you online in all the various venues, and that includes these live online conferences. So thanks so much for being here. By the way, the recordings from the first 2 sessions today are already posted. So after this live session, do know that you can head back to the same page you used to visit this website to get in here today. You'll find it, the recordings from our earlier sessions. So we hope you'll check those out. We do have people who are joining us for the first time today, and I did want to point out that thanks to our very talented friends, and yes, they are human, the people who are transcribing our words here today are very talented steno captioners from WGBH, and we thank them for their stamina in keeping up with us, even as we use lots of big jargon and vocabulary and talk about issues really quickly. You're doing very well, and we thank you for that. I'm making you nervous now, so I won't do that. Also wanted to point out we are on Twitter, and feel free to tag your posts that you may share with the Shout Learning tag so we can keep up with your conversations. And also don't hesitate to come back and visit us on Facebook. So with that, though, I am going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. And our next speaker is actually, as I mentioned, in Panama. Her name is Sunshine von Bael, and she is a community ecologist, and I love that title. And she's on the research staff at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, also known as STRI, S-T-R-I for short, in Panama. And she studies plant-animal interactions and the importance of those relationships to biodiversity in tropical regions. And her studies have included the conservation of tropical species, the improvement of agricultural systems to increase sustainability and biodiversity, and we're going to enjoy a conversation with her right now. So please jump in with your questions and your comments as we go along. Sunshine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a beautiful day in Panama, and I'm really excited to participate in this and start telling you about my research. But first, I'd like to start with a story. This is a story about a famous person in history, Chairman Mao. So Mao was a very controversial leader in China. And in the late 1950s, he called for many agricultural reforms that included the eradication of farm pests. And Mao thought that this innocent-looking little sparrow was one of the more important pests because he saw sparrows eating the grains that farmers were growing in their fields. So what he did is he instructed all farm workers and their families to kill all of the sparrows that they encountered with the goal of complete eradication. And so in the following years, crops failed for many reasons, but most of the crops that did grow were eventually decimated by insect pests. So what Mao didn't realize was that the sparrows were not just eating the grains, but they were also eating insects. So by controlling the insect population, the sparrows were keeping the agricultural system in balance. Now, unfortunately, millions of people died in the Chinese famine between 1958 and 1961. This is the largest famine in the history of the country. And now we can also see by studying the historical records that this famine was not due to just bad weather, but because of lots of the agricultural changes and decisions that Mao had made. So it was a man-made disaster. So at the same time that this famine was occurring, ecologists in other parts of the world were beginning to understand more about how food chains work. Here on this slide, I'm showing how predators, herbivores, and producers are related to each other. So in the story of Mao versus the sparrow, the birds were essential predators of insects. The birds were providing an ecosystem service by keeping insect populations under control. So that leads me to an important question. We should define what is an ecosystem service. So a simple definition of an ecosystem service are benefits to humans provided by nature. And the broad categories or names that we give to different kinds of ecosystem services are provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting ecosystem services. And some important examples within these categories are the production of food, clean water, fuel. Regulating ecosystem services have to do with disease control and control of the weather. We have our cultural services, which include enjoyment of the natural world, and then our supporting services, some examples are pollination and pest control. So these are all things, these are all benefits to humans provided by nature. So birds have quite a few ecosystem roles. I've mentioned a couple of them already. Birds are important pollinators and predators of insects and other vertebrates. They're also very important for seed dispersal and sometimes for seed predation. In this case, they may help humans by eating seeds that we don't want to spread, for example, of invasive plants. They can also be important scavengers. A good example of this are vultures that come and remove the carcasses of dead animals and prevent disease from spreading. And finally, birds can be ecosystem engineers. An ecosystem engineer is any organism that creates or modifies a habitat and therefore facilitates another species to survive in that habitat. So a good example of that for birds are woodpeckers. And when they tap on trees and make holes in them in older dead trees, these holes provide habitat for many other species, even some other bird species. So birds and humans also have lots of important interrelationships. And so the kinds of ecosystem services or interactions that we have with birds include our consumption of domestic fowl, birds that we eat from hunting. Birds, in the sense of disease, can have positive and negative interactions with humans. As we've seen recently, they can be vectors of disease. But they're also important for controlling disease because birds eat a lot of mosquitoes. And as I mentioned earlier, scavenging birds are good for cleaning up the system. So birds also are important because of their pollination and their seed dispersal and pest control. And birds also have cultural importance to humans. Bird tourism provides a huge income in lots of parts of the world. It's estimated that in the United States alone, there are 45 million bird watchers, and they spend quite a bit of money to support this hobby. So, another key aspect of bird biology is that birds migrate. So they can often have ecosystem roles on very different parts of the planet. So here on this migration map, you can see, I'm going to point with my pointer to Panama, right here in between North and South America. You can see that lots of these lines, there's a very thick orange line leading through Panama that shows that many bird species depend on Panama, which is where I'm based and where my research is based and where I live. So Panama has an extremely small landmass, but the biodiversity of birds in Panama is huge. There are 968 different species that have been observed here. If you contrast this to the entire United States and Canada, which is a huge landmass in comparison, you'll see only 600 species. So as I mentioned on the last slide, Panama is an important pathway and destination for many migratory birds. And Panama also has many globally important sites for migratory birds that have no protection and they're under threat from development. So my research in Panama involves interactions among birds, insects, plants, and also humans. So I study how birds indirectly help plants, how they help regeneration of degraded areas, and also how human land management practices can help provide habitat for lots of different bird species. So shade crops are one very important way that humans can manage their land to provide a livelihood for themselves and also to preserve habitat for birds. So shade crops grow under 1 or 2 layers of native rainforest trees. The crops are in the bottom of the system. My pointer again here. The crops are growing down here in this case. And if you move up here, you have a layer of shade trees and then emergent trees. And these are generally trees that were originally existing in the rainforest. So while the farmer can harvest from crops at the lowest level, the higher canopy trees provide habitat for a high diversity of rainforest species. So one of those species that the farmers can grow under shade is cacao or cocoa. The scientific name is Theobroma cacao, and I'll be referring to it as cacao throughout the presentation. And this is the source of chocolate. So over here, you can see, I'm going to try to get my pointer over here, you can see cacao pods that are growing from the base of the cacao tree, from the stem. And here, closer up, these are some pods that are open, and you can see that the cacao fruit is actually white. It's quite delicious. When you harvest one of these off of the tree, you can suck the fruit off of the pods, and it tastes a little bit like strawberries or watermelon. Surprising taste. And then, in order to get cacao beans, I'm going to point there at the beans here. I'm showing some pictures of beans, cacao beans that have been fermented and roasted. Or not roasted, I'm sorry, dried out in the sun. The actual roasting of the beans doesn't happen until they're shipped, usually to the United States or Europe, to produce chocolate. So this is the product that the farmers make throughout Central and South America. So cacao is a rainforest shade crop, and it's an exciting crop because it supports both humans and biodiversity, as I mentioned earlier. So lots of different rainforest organisms can survive in cacao farms when they're grown under the shade of rainforest trees. So Central and South America is thought to be the origin of cacao, but actually it's grown all throughout the world now. So here I'm going to point to Panama with my pointer. But you can see that in other parts of the world, in Africa and in Southeast Asia, quite a bit of cacao is now being cultivated in those regions. But in today's talk, I'm going to focus on Panama because that's where my research has been. So here's a larger map of the Republic of Panama. And in the red circle, I've highlighted the region called Bocas del Toro. And I have blown that region up so you can see that there are mountains along the coast of the Atlantic or the Caribbean, and also lots of islands. So cacao is grown in Bocas del Toro by about 1,000 families. They tend to cultivate cacao on a very small scale, and most of the growers are from indigenous groups of Panama. So relative to most other countries, the production in Panama of cacao is quite small. And all of the cacao produced in Panama, or at least 95% of it, is certified organic. And that's because spraying cacao with pesticides and insecticides usually doesn't help against the major pests. And also, most of the farmers are not wealthy enough to be able to buy those pesticides and insecticides either. So early in the 1970s, they organized themselves and became one of the first co-ops in Panama and received organic certification. So in general, in Panama, cacao is grown as polyculture with lots of different other crops, including bananas and citrus. And then farmers also grow trees, which can double as both shade trees for the cacao crops, but then can be harvested later on for timber. And the cacao farmers in Panama are also becoming involved in apiculture and in beekeeping. And so they're beginning to produce organic honey. So in this region, the land use alternatives are bananas and cattle. And in general, bananas are grown in a very intensive, mechanized fashion by big companies. And in contrast, cattle are usually grazed by smaller families in smaller plots of land. And when you compare these different kinds of land use in Bocas del Toro, you can see that there are huge benefits of keeping these areas of land in shaded cacao. So in an organic chocolate farm, you have a very high biodiversity of rainforest, flora and fauna. Numerous ecosystem services are provided because of those trees being there. So the trees help produce clean water, and the supporting of biodiversity and pollination and pest control is also very important. Also, the chocolate farming methods are really quite sustainable. So once a chocolate tree is planted, it can live up to 50 years or longer, and it provides a new crop of chocolate 1 or 2 times a year. So over and over, these trees are productive, producing a crop for these farmers. If you compare that to when land is cleared to graze cattle, you see quite a different picture. So in these landscapes, you tend to see much lower biodiversity. The land will experience lots of runoff, and this erosion into the waterways can destroy mangroves and coral reefs. It also can threaten fisheries and tourism, and in general the economy in the area. So the land becomes degraded really quickly when cattle are grazing, and over the long term it's not a sustainable land use. So my research has been involved at looking at whether or not birds, and here I'm going to be talking about them as insectivores because they eat insects, whether or not birds affect insect densities and damage to plants. So when we want to do an experiment like this, generally what we do is what we call an exclosure experiment. And an exclosure experiment involves building a mesh cage around a tree or a branch. And that mesh cage allows insects to move in and out, but it keeps birds and bats and lizards, larger insectivores, off of the trees. And then we can compare what happens with control trees that do not have mesh covering them. And we can watch and monitor over time what happens to the insect communities inside of the mesh cages versus on our control trees. And then we can estimate what the effect of vertebrate predation or insectivore predation on insects is to the trees. So I've been involved in several such experiments in Panama, and I'm just going to talk about one of them briefly here. In Bocas del Toro, we tested whether or not birds were providing this ecosystem service to humans by reducing pests on cacao trees. And then we also asked whether or not farmers can manage their farms for greater bird abundance and diversity. But to do this, we did a very large-scale survey. It was the first bird survey in the region, in the mainland of Bocas del Toro. And we compared birds in cacao farms to forest fragments that were nearby. And we also surveyed the vegetation in these farms to get an understanding of how the farmers were managing these landscapes. So one thing that we found, we were excited to see lots of these interesting herbivores. These were all caterpillars that we collected that were feeding on cacao trees. You can see there's a huge diversity of just caterpillars alone. There are also lots of other types of insects that feed on cacao. And what we found with our exposure experiment is that birds actually really did increase the insect abundance on the trees. So basically what this graph here shows is that in all 3 of the months where we measured it, the trees that did not have insectivores, so that were protected from bird foraging, had much higher insect abundances than the trees that did not. And the same was true when we ended up looking at damage to the leaves on the trees. So again, the upper line here with the clear open circles, those are censuses where birds could not forage. And the closed circles show where they could forage. And so you can see that leaf damage was much higher where birds could not forage. So this was similar to what we found for the insects. We also found some slightly surprising things from our bird census data. What we found was that on cacao farms, if you look at these numbers comparing the overall mean of the individuals in a cacao farm versus a forest fragment, they're actually slightly higher in a cacao farm than in a forest fragment. This is the number of individuals, so the abundance of birds. And then also the number of species down here was slightly higher in the cacao farms relative to the forest fragments. And this was especially true for migratory birds. And here in red, you can see that there were many, many more migratory birds in cacao farms than in forest fragments.
Sunshine, this is Jonathan here. I just wanted to jump in a moment. There's a few great questions that came in, and one was actually related to this last slide. I wanted to go ahead and just bring that up. The question was, why are the results so similar during the June month?
That's a good question. We actually think it might be because, I'm going to use my pointer here. It might be because the insect populations right here in these earlier months are low enough that the birds can kind of keep them under control. But then when the insect populations get very, very high, so this is after the rainy season begins and we see a big flush of insects, it could be that the birds just can't even act fast enough to control to limit the insect population. So that's why we saw that there in June. So it was during the peak of insect abundance where we might have seen this leaf damage difference.
Fascinating. Here's one more question from Cheryl, who says, are there negative impacts from the change in bird abundance?
Does she mean in the exposure experiment?
I think so, Cheryl. Let us know if otherwise, but I think so.
Right. Basically, what I'm showing here are negative impacts if you're an insect or positive impacts if you're a plant. Does that make sense? So birds are showing negative impacts on the insect communities, but they're indirectly helping the plant. They're showing positive impacts on the plant because they're reducing the insect abundance and the insect damage.
Great. Thanks, Sunshine.
Okay, so I will keep going then. Unless you have any other questions, feel free to raise
By the way, there were a few others about the cacao plant, and we'll come back to those at the end. But there's and also a lot of reminiscing about some people who've spent some part of their lives enjoying those plants and are thinking about the taste of the fruit when you were describing it earlier too.
Excellent. So this is a little bit more about why we saw more bird species in the cacao habitat than we did in the forest. And when we looked at the types of birds that we saw in the two habitats, we actually realized that there was a combination of two broad groups of birds. We had forest birds that were also living in cacao farms, but then we had agricultural species, a species that we're more used to seeing out where humans live and where they're growing crops. So it seems like cacao habitat is a really big mixing ground for these different kinds of bird species. And then, as I mentioned before, there were just a huge number and abundance of migratory bird species using the cacao habitat. And we found 94 bird species that were present in both forest and cacao. But we also found 46 bird species that were not found in cacao farms. They were only in forests. This was 20% of all of the species we saw. And if we were to say what kinds of birds those were, they tended to be birds that depended on the forest floor and the litter of the forest floor. Those birds did not tend to do so well in cacao farms relative to forests. So I also mentioned earlier that we did some vegetation surveys to figure out how bird densities and species correlated with different ways that farmers were managing their shade. And so when we put all of these data together, we found things that pretty much made common sense if you would think about what birds would tend to like. So the higher the forest canopy was and the more depth that the canopy had, the more kinds of birds and the higher abundance of birds. And this was true also for the diversity of different tree species in the canopy over the birds. And also when farmers had a higher level of crop diversity on their plots, we found higher levels of bird abundance and diversity. So everything that I've explained to you now is about cacao in Panama, but I've also worked with colleagues at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center who have tons of work, tons of studies focused on coffee and shaded coffee crops in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Belize, and in El Salvador, and in Costa Rica. So I have worked together with these colleagues to do several studies. And we're very interested in how different ways of managing coffee and cacao farms. So you can see here, I'm pointing to a very complex agroforestry system where there's a crop layer of coffee on the bottom and a very complex rainforest shade here. And then the complexity can decrease, and you can even get some farmers who are just planting everything out in the sun with no shade. So we're interested in the implications of this for birds and their ability to provide this ecosystem service of removing insects. So here on this graph, we're showing across all of those sites a little comparison of how important birds were in the canopy versus the understory of the agroforestry systems. And here on this graph, I have the percent of arthropods removed. Arthropods, you can think of those as insects plus spiders. And basically, what we're showing here in the darker bars is that birds had much bigger effects of decreasing insects in the canopy than they did in the understory. And this goes along with what I told you earlier about how cacao farms and agroforestry systems can support lots of birds in the canopy, but they're not doing so well in the lower levels where the farmers are working and where the crops are planted. So we also were very interested in whether or not migratory birds really drive this ecosystem service. So we looked at what happens to pest control or removal of pests by birds when migrants were present versus when migrants were absent. And this gets back to a question that I noticed in the chat box earlier about whether or not the difference in migratory bird species can affect this overall control. And I didn't answer that because I knew that we were getting to this slide in the next one. But here again, we're showing that, especially for large insects, that the presence of migratory birds is very important for this ecosystem service. And when we correlate the number of migratory bird species, and we correlate that with the percent of arthropod reduction, we find a tight and significant correlation. So this tells us that where we have more bird species, we will have a greater ecosystem service from those birds. We'll get a higher level of pest control. So here I'm going to summarize.
Just a quick question about that, and maybe it's on the summary right here, so maybe I should wait. But in terms of the reasoning behind, or why that might be the case, if there are more species, there's greater pest control. Is it sort of a lock and key model then, that when there are more species, more insects can be accounted for based on diet and predatory patterns?
Yeah, it's hard to say what the mechanism for this, and we've done some other studies to try and see if this is really an effect of vegetation and vegetational differences, and that the birds are just kind of following along with the diversity of birds. We found that that was not true. We also tested whether or not it was the density of birds, the abundance of birds that made that were the most important part of this relationship, and that also was not true. And so I guess our best guess at this point is that the more species you have in a habitat, the more likely you are to have one or two or three that are very, very important for this ecosystem service. And so right now, that's our working hypothesis.
Interesting. We have a couple of other questions. Let me let you do the summary, and then we'll take a couple of these questions.
Okay, that sounds fine. Okay. So to summarize, we have found that shade crops can provide habitat for birds and also a sustainable livelihood for humans. We've found that farmers can manage their shade trees to provide timber and also to provide better habitat for birds. We found that birds have strong effects on reducing insects and their damage in the shaded cacao and coffee systems throughout Central America. And we found that bird effects were greater when migratory birds were present, and that they increased with more species of migratory birds. And so now I'd like to take a step backwards and take a broader look at sustainability, more at the planet level. And about 10 years ago, a large group of scientists that were very highly respected got together and did a report called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And they assessed how our planet was doing. And all of these reports are available online, and they're very interesting. And these are some of the main results that they found in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. They found that most species are suffering a decline in population size and range. They found that over the planet, the distribution of species are becoming more homogeneous, so more similar. And this is probably true because we have lots of species that are invading areas where they were not before and taking over and reducing biodiversity in those areas. And they've also found increased extinction rates for almost all taxa that they looked at. So what's driving this? Another important part of this report showed that the major source of biodiversity loss is land conversion from forest to cropland and pasture. So what's really driving this decrease in biodiversity across the planet is production of food. So, of course, an important question that we have now, as we're facing an increasing population, is how can we balance food production with biodiversity conservation? And I'm just going to go through a couple of different concepts here, and then I'll open it up to discussion and questions. But in a lot of ways, we need to learn how to make our agriculture more sustainable. We're often doing it in ways using synthetic fertilizers or pesticides that have negative effects on the environment and can also lead to degradation of the soil. So we need to learn to farm more with nature instead of against nature. We also need to think about how we graze cattle and change how we graze cattle. So especially on forest frontiers, a lot of slash and burn techniques are being used. This means that the farmers will cut down trees and burn the area before they plant grass for cattle to graze on. So one solution to this are silvopastoral systems. And these are systems that include trees in pastures and live fences. And they also use sustainable food sources for the domestic animals. So instead of just having cattle grazing on grasses, they look for plants, sometimes plants from the rainforest, that can be grown in a sustainable way. Sometimes they're called foraging banks. And then the cattle can graze in those areas and get their nutrition in a way that's more sustainable than how they've traditionally been grazed. So another way that we can contribute to the livelihood of farmers and also the conservation of bird biodiversity is by including visits to farms when we are tourists. So bird tourism is widespread in coffee farms throughout Central America. And in these farms, birds are easy to see, and tourists enjoy learning a lot about the eco-friendly agricultural systems in different cultures. And this is good for farmers because they are rewarded with extra income for using these biodiversity-friendly practices.
A quick question for you on either on bird tourism or on the approach you were talking about placing in silvopastoral systems and putting trees in pastures. Stephanie's curious, are there examples of places where either of these practices are actually in use?
Absolutely. So these practices, I'm referring specifically to a system called intensive silvopastoral systems, have been developed in Colombia by a group called CATIE, C-A-T-I-E, are the letters, and then CIPAV, C-I-P-A-V, in Colombia. And in Costa Rica, there is also an organization called CATIE, and they are also involved in figuring out ways that we can solve this problem, that we can make cattle grazing more sustainable. So those two countries have really gotten a head start, and especially in Colombia, they've discovered some really great plants that can be used in these foraging banks, so that the cattle don't have to graze extensively and the land can be used for years and years and years instead of just a few years and then having the farmer move on to another plot. So they also use very careful grazing rotations, because one real problem with cattle is that when they're grazing on the land, the compaction from the weight of their bodies and from their hooves on the soil really degrades the soil. And if you very carefully control that and only let them graze in some areas at a time, this contributes to the sustainability of the soil. So they've worked out these systems, these forage systems and these alternative grazing systems, so that a plot of land can be used for much, much longer. And some of these systems are just beginning in Panama. They've begun in the region called the Darien, and also recently in the region called Chiriquí, and in another area called Los Santos. These projects are just beginning. The farmers and the extension workers in Panama are learning from these organizations in Colombia and Costa Rica. And I'm very happy to report that these kinds of projects are beginning in Panama. And one part of my research is going to be to look at how these practices affect the ecological covariate, so the bird species diversity, and also insect species diversity, and how these are affected by using these sustainable techniques. So I'll move on. I talked about farm tourism and how people can make a contribution towards sustainable practices by visiting farms that are using these practices, supporting those farmers. Another way we can support these sustainable techniques are by buying products that are certified. So the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, which is part of the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., has its own certification program, and it's the only certification program for 100% organic and bird-friendly coffee. And so when this label is on their coffee, it produces a higher profit for the farmers. And part of that profit then gets turned back into research. So in fact, much of the research that I talked about today was funded with profits from bird-friendly coffee. And so here I put a link to where you can find a retailer for bird-friendly coffee. So contributing to sustainability is something you can do every day when you make your coffee. And this is a screenshot of the website for the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, and I just want to point out to the teachers who are online that there are also some teaching modules here on this site. And this is about it. Before I finish, I just want to get in one last little plug, and then I'll take some more questions. I've been involved in developing a new Smithsonian website for teachers and kids. It's also about agriculture, but it's about insects who do agriculture. And these insects are called leaf-cutting ants. They grow a fungus underground, and that fungus is their crop. And so this website is based on symbiosis. Those are relationships, close relationships between two different kinds of species. And in this case, we're looking at a symbiosis between, or a relationship between leaf-cutting ants and the fungus that they grow as their food. And so here on the site, we have some teacher's plans and a downloadable coloring book that's in the style of a comic book. Actually, it's kind of aimed for between 2nd and 5th grade, and it's also bilingual in English and Spanish. And then also several videos showing the leaf-cutting ants and what they do in the wild. And that's all I have for the presentation. So I would be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you. And by the way, this is a really lovely site. And from a design perspective, by the way, not only is it a lovely site to look at, I love the way you integrated and made it a bilingual site, even right in the title. I'll just go back so people can see what I'm talking about. There at the top left, for example. Very, very nice.
Well, I work with a fantastic artist who gets all the credit for that. His name is Damon Kylo, and he's incredible. So I won't take credit for the design.
It's very, very efficient, as many of the animals are that you've been talking about today. And you're getting some immediate feedback. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the questions that have already come in. And if you can think of others, we do have some time with sunshine here today, so do jump right in. There, earlier in the talk when you were giving us some background on cacao and it as a plant and a crop, a couple of these questions came in. Is shade-grown coffee cultivation similar to cacao?
Yes, they're very similar. So coffee and cacao are grown under the shade in almost in almost the same way. So the farmer historically will have gone into a rainforested area and cut out some of the underbrush, leave all of the big trees there, and then plant their crops under the shade of those big trees. And the methods are very similar for coffee and cacao.
Also, are there other shade crops besides cacao? Was a question that we saw earlier.
Coffee and cacao are really the two main shade crops that we hear a lot about. Both of them grow very well in the shade. Lots of other crops don't do as well. Um, so, yeah, one thing that I think we kind of have to change our opinion of is that cattle, even though they're not crops, cattle are organisms that we can grow in the shade. We need to figure out how to, like I said, get a lot more trees in those systems, because it's the the grazing lands that are really causing a lot of destruction. The farmers are constantly moving around and burning new plots of land, and the land gets degraded so quickly. So we need to figure out how to get them to stay put a little bit more and to grow more trees in those areas, so that they're depending less on grass and on other trees and shrubs that can grow in the shade. But so far, coffee and cacao are the two main shade crops.
Cheryl went on to say that the idea of shade crop seems like such a great way to maintain the natural forest while allowing people to plant and harvest crops. Are there downsides for the forest?
Definitely, yeah. It's definitely not like keeping the forest in a pristine habitat. Like I mentioned, there were 20% of the bird species that we saw. We could not find them in the cacao areas. So it's not a it's not the same as keeping a forest, but it's certainly better than the alternatives, which I mentioned earlier, tend to be cattle or bananas in the area, or oil palm in other parts of the world.
Yeah. Here's a comment. Worldwide, is crop growing more damaging to the environment than development, for example, building?
I would say yes, and I would base that answer on the Millennium ecosystem assessment and their analysis of what is causing these huge changes in the ecosystem around the world. And they really identified food growing, so crops and pasture lands, as being the key drivers of these problems.
By the way, Carolyn in Connecticut says that her cousins were missionaries in Peru and was told that about slash and burn mentality, but how it was life or death for the residents. It's so much better if these alternative methods can be adopted. As the groups that you talked about are going out and introducing some of the alternate methods and more balanced approaches to farmers, is it a tough sell? Is it really clear right from the start? I know you've told us some success stories, but do they have to see? I assume the more proof and the more other stories there are, the easier it is.
It actually is a tough sell in a lot of cases. It really depends on the community and kind of the vision of the community that this is being implemented in. And in some cases, the farmers find that it's just a lot easier. There's a lot less labor involved in burning a plot and then moving on when the land is degraded. It only takes a couple seconds to light a match and then a couple of hours to burn the field. And that's a lot different than setting up fences and growing your forage bank so that you can keep the cattle coming back to the same areas and not degrading the land. And so a lot of it also depends on land tenure and whether or not the farmer owns that plot of land and what their long-term plans are. In a lot of places around the world and in Panama, the land is really not owned by the people who are grazing cattle on it, so they don't really care about the long-term consequences. In contrast to the farmers who have title land and they really want to focus on having that land there and producing for them down the line. So it is a difficult issue, and but I think that improvements are being made, and we need to be moving into a direction where grazing is done in a more sustainable
You
manner.
were just addressing this, but since the surname is in common with yours, this person will take complete precedence in making sure we get this question addressed. Marilyn, with your namesake, says, I love the idea of growing trees with the cattle. Are cattle ranchers open to that?
It's that part is also a tough sell. So they realize that the more trees they have in their pasture, the less grass will grow under those trees. And so what needs to happen is they need to shift away from depending only on the grass for their cattle to eat and shift towards these forage banks where they're growing other plants that are not grasses, that are bushes and also sometimes even trees or shrubs. And focusing more on using this for nutrition for the cattle. So it is a hard sell in some cases. And in a lot of cases, it depends also on how badly degraded the land has become. If a farmer owns a piece of land and he's not able to move on, and he needs to stay on that piece of land, he's much more open to trying these alternative techniques of growing shrubs and trees that the cattle will eat instead of grass.
By the way, when it comes to introducing these uh, alternative approaches, Stephanie was wondering, um, is the positive change that's being initiated in the countries you've mentioned, is it coming from the government? Is it non-governmental organizations, farming collectives?
It's non-governmental and farming collectives. Yeah, they're. I would say the most government may be from CATIE. So CATIE in Costa Rica gets a lot of government funding, but CIPAV in Colombia is a non-governmental organization. It's a research organization. And in Panama, we have several organizations, one which is associated with Yale University and the Smithsonian. It's called LT, the Environmental Leadership Training Initiative. And they are really pushing a lot of these ideas forward in Panama. And again, it's a academic consortium more than a non-governmental organization.
I encourage you to keep submitting questions. I did want to point out and echo some of Heidi's comments a little earlier in the chat about some great resources where you and students and colleagues can continue your exploration. And by the way, I noticed that we have a number of students who are logged in today with us, including one middle schooler who's taking furious notes all along. And don't forget, we've recorded this for you and for your friends at school if you want to go ahead and tell them what you know and encourage them to come back as well and see the recording. All of the sessions today have been recorded, including this one. And you can also take a look at a couple of these other resources. The Teacher's Guide, a fantastic resource. You can find that in a number of places, most easily at the top right corner of shoutlearning.org. You can also visit from that site, you can link off to the partnersinlearningnetwork.com from Microsoft Partners in Learning and to the site that Heidi mentioned a little bit earlier in the chat, which you'll see there on the right side as well. And there's some great fun challenges in the Teacher's Guide and link you back over to the TIG Ed site where you can go ahead and be part of the conversation. And don't forget, Facebook and Twitter are also great places to connect with us with Shout Learning as our name in both places. Let's see here. I did see another question come in here from Carolyn. I live near Yale. Do they ever send out representatives to local schools to educate students about these sustainability options? What an interesting idea. Do you ever see any of that in Panama?
We definitely have some educational programs in Panama. And a lot of them are generated by the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And there's been a fantastic resource for Panamanians in Spanish. And part of this whole initiative from LT and from STRI is to teach Panamanians, students and adults, about native tree species and the importance of planting native tree species rather than exotic tree species like teak. And so they've created these wonderful resources which may be available as PDF, I'm not sure, but they were printed in the local newspaper. And so for several months last year, everybody who received a newspaper in Panama had these wonderful guides talking about the native trees in Panama. I'm less familiar with what kinds of initiatives the Yale University has in the area around Yale. Um, but maybe I can get back to you on that later.
Oh, fair enough. By the way, there's a question from Irene about whether you have any insights on the deforestation going on in the Darien region. And by the way, Irene joins us from Colombia.
There is massive deforestation going on in the Darien region. And one of the areas where these sustainable techniques from CPAV in Colombia were first initiated are in the Darien. And yeah, I know that the deforestation rates are extremely high, and in that case, it's less of a slash and burn issue, and it's more of huge multinational companies going in and extracting the timber to sell as wood. So it's a different issue there. But what generally happens is that after that extraction of timber occurs, those logging companies build a lot of roads into the forest, and so then after the logging companies come the humans. And so then more and more farmers will have more access to those areas that used to be forest. So we can expect to see much more cattle grazing, slash and burn type cattle grazing going on in those areas in the future, unless we can convince everybody to change their ways and get people to get their land titled and stay in one place. So that's the ideal for sure.
Great, thank you for that. I did want to point out, by the way, that although this is the last of the 3 sessions today, there are a couple of other things you will want to keep in mind. We do have another tree banding update, so if you missed our first one today or want to come back for a second one, we're going to be met with by Josh Falk, who's actually online with us right now. He'll be back in 1 hour in the same place. He'll be joined by a couple of teachers who are part of this amazing citizen science project, which has to do with looking at the growth of trees in each of our own neighborhoods and areas. So for those of you already involved and haven't stopped by our update earlier today, come on back and be part of that discussion. We'll keep it brief. You'll learn a little bit about the project if you're new to it, and compare notes with some other teachers. And there's Josh inviting you to come join us. So he's got, I believe, our friend from New Zealand will be back, Chris, who's one of the teachers involved in the project, and also, I believe, Jolie Brock might be back joining us again from Texas. So tune in for that. And by the way, the Shout Conference series is not over today either. The next conference is on valuing the land. That's conference number 6. It's on July 13th. If you've registered for this event, you're registered for that one, but go back, check it out, share it with others, and mark your calendar because we'd love to see you back again. Would you join me in thanking Sunshine for joining us, and I know rearranging her evening this evening in terms of children and work and balancing those so beautifully. And but balance seems to be one of the great themes that Sunshine is great at. So we want to thank you so much.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
We also encourage you to take a moment to fill out the evaluation at the top left to give us some feedback so that we can ensure that we integrate what works best into each and every session we do here for you and with you. So thanks again, everyone. We'll see you in an hour at the tree banding update. We hope you'll be there. Take care, everyone.